This is Steve Vinson. You're about to experience the life science effect. Hello, aspiring leaders. Welcome to another episode of the Life Science Effect, where we work to answer the question, what does it take for me to be an effective leader in the field of life sciences? Each week, we will talk to the best in the business to answer your questions about what it takes to be a leader in life sciences. The good, the bad, and the ugly. And always be asking yourself, what effect will you cause? And welcome to the show. Something a little bit different today. We have a partner with Barnes & Thornburg. Deborah Pollack-Milgate is a partner with one of the largest law firms in the U.S. Welcome, Deborah.
Thank you very much.
Why don't you go ahead and correct anything I said wrong, which I didn't say much, so there probably won't be much you need to correct. But tell us more about yourself, your background, and what you do.
Sure. Well, thank you, and thank you for having me on today. I've been an attorney at Barnes & Thornburg since 2001 now, and I focus on the area of intellectual property, and I do a lot of work in the life science industry. And what's great about my job and why I like my job is that really my goal in life is to help those in the life science industry and other technical areas as well protect what they've created, protect their innovations. And as part of that, I get a window into the many fascinating projects that are always going on around our community, path-breaking projects, and so on and so forth. So I count myself very lucky to be part of that community and to be able to see and keep track of all of the innovations that are happening in the life sciences industry.
Great. And that sort of leads into my next question, which is, my first question. You're a member of the Indiana Health Industry Forum Board.
Yes.
You are frequent moderator of the Life Science Lunch that Barnes & Thornburg and IHIF generously do. And your background is mostly IP, antitrust type law, and things like that on a general basis. What led you to get so focused on life sciences?
Well, what led me to be focused on life sciences and intellectual property too, more generally, is just the fact that when you are working in this space, you really the opportunity for learning is never ending. And so I find, whereas when I was younger, I wasn't necessarily completely focused in school, maybe the way I should have been. But as an adult, I love learning. And when you work with clients in the life science industry, the potential for learning is just unending. And so as I went along in my career, I had the opportunity. I could have focused more on general commercial litigation, but I chose to focus more on the intellectual property litigation. I do some of both, and intellectual property counseling. And it's absolutely my favorite work, just because, again, you are always learning. You have a window into some of the most brilliant minds that are out there, and sort of have your pulse on what the next greatest innovation is going to be.
And you get to help them. I've noticed scientists, researchers, brilliant people, but may not realize what they need to do to protect themselves later if they have a viable product, right? So that's where your firm and you specifically come in to help them identify what is it that is intellectual property that ought to be protected, right?
Yes, and we could talk about that the entire time. So what I find interesting, for example, is that if you meet with a chemist, for example, who's working on whatever innovation, and you will say, listen, I think that the two elements that you've mixed together are novel. They say, oh, no, any chemist would do that. Yeah. And to the PhD chemist mind, the combination was obvious, but it's not obvious to everyone else who's out there. And so what I find is sometimes that the science, the scientist doesn't really recognize always that there's an innovation or not, because it seems obvious to the scientist when in fact it's really not obvious to the rest of the world. And the other place that I really like getting involved is also with startups. I know that intellectual property can be very intimidating, but you really can, just giving an hour or two to a smaller company, help them map out an intellectual property strategy for moving forward that will serve them well. And so that's also something that is very satisfying to me. And I think something that startups, smaller life sciences companies really need to be aware of, and to make sure that they take that step and take a look at what they have and how they best protect it.
So we do have a number of entrepreneurs and startup people that listen. So what do you have a story about intellectual property or anything that you're passionate about really that sort of exemplifies how your leadership has played a role in either protecting somebody's intellectual property or maybe inspiring somebody's success?
Sure. Well, I think in some instances where especially startups get into or have a more difficult time is that the path to intellectual property protection isn't obvious. And so, for example, now if there's software involved, and there is these days often some sort of software involved, these days that's very difficult to protect from an intellectual property perspective. On the other hand, though, you might have the ability to have a license in place that would protect the use of your software, for example, or there may be some ability you have to protect the product from reverse engineering. And so I don't know that I have one particular story to share on this side, except that intellectual property protection is something more than just patent protection. There are many different methods that you can use to protect what you've created, and you need to explore all of them. And so I guess that would be my main advice. It would be not to think about intellectual property protection just in terms of patents or trademarks, but to really think more broadly about how you put a system in place to protect the value of your intellectual work.
Interesting. Because that's the first thing I think of is when I think of IP is patents.
Right.
The other thing I'm famous for is using the law firm of Google and Google. And I think startup companies are going to be notorious for that, I'm sure. By the time they finally get to you for expert advice, they've probably already read every Wikipedia article there is.
And sometimes they've sold the farm already.
Oh, so. yeah. They thought they found the right article, but they didn't.
Yes.
So your answer might be, maybe it's obvious, but I'll ask anyway. What's the right point at which a startup should be contacting a firm like Barnes and Thornburg?
Yeah, I mean, the right time is as soon as you have the idea. And I say that because our natural inclination, and my natural inclination too, so I mean, I think most of us share this attribute, which is you have an idea and you want to share it with everyone around. Yeah. And in the context of intellectual property, that's the worst thing that you could do. So I don't mean idea in the sense of something just pops into your head, but idea that you have really a concept in place and you know how you're going to get from point A to point B. That's a really good time to talk to someone who protects intellectual property to guide the process. And certainly no later than you have something tangibly on paper, you should be talking to someone to map out what your path forward is. And even though it's also not obvious, sometimes talking to an IP attorney or specialist before you're in this process can even guide your research process a little bit. So there's really, I guess we like to think that we're really valuable, but I think we really, are. And where I think some companies get held up too is just by being overwhelmed by the cost of it. And IP protection can be expensive, but the reality is, just speaking to someone for an hour or two is always going to be worth your trouble.
Here's a thought. If you're a researcher, you discover something, or maybe you're just part of a startup team, and you have something that you think could go into a clinical trial or a medical device that maybe you're going to try to get marketing approval, you wouldn't hesitate to call up Pearl Pathways or somebody to get regulatory advice on what are the things I need to be thinking about now as I develop this thing to get it into a clinical trial or something like that. And why would you hesitate then to get your IP protected as well? And to your point, we've talked, it seems like every episode we talk about the importance of networking. Yes. Maybe because I started with Kristen Jones, who's all about networking, right? But if you come to events like we just finished, the Life Science Lunch, there are people here like Deborah, and I'm sure there are other IP attorneys in attendance that, hey, you exchange cards. Oh, you're an IP attorney. Can I ask you a quick question? And that may lead to them saying, it's a little early. Give me a call in a couple months or a year. Or it may lead to, oh, man, we probably ought to sit down right now, And then to your point, yeah, you might save a few $1,000 now, but just think of the opportunity cost down the road.
Yes, that's right. And I think the other point that we touched on already is if you think about IP, you think about patents, but there are also much less expensive ways to protect what you have. And so even the smallest startup, there will be a path that you can choose for yourself from an intellectual property perspective that is perhaps less onerous from a financial perspective than another one. So no one should assume we can't afford IP protection. You may not be able to afford the ideal IP protection, but there are certainly things you can do to minimize your risk.
Fantastic. I knew we would talk about IP. I didn't know we would go this far. I hope this is really, I think it'll be really valuable for the type of people that listen. Shifting gears a little bit on a more general focus, you've had success in your career and you continue to grow and have success. People who maybe want to follow in your footsteps, maybe they want to be a partner at a law firm or some sort of leader in life science. Do you have any advice, some things that you wish you had known when you were first starting out?
Well, so if I have a lot of advice, obviously, on this subject. I guess what I might do first is talk about what I think are the best attributes of a leader, and really what we should all strive to be, and how we make our organizations a place that we want to go to work to, and also be successful. And so for me, those attributes are that you want to bring creativity to your job. You should never be thinking of things as they've always been done this way, and therefore I'm going to do them forever. And I guess that's obvious to people in the life science industry since we're innovating all of the time. I think you also want a person who's smart, but frankly, we're all smart. The more important combination with smart is to be humble. And to recognize that you don't have all the answers, right? I mean, the worst combination is smart combined with a very large ego, which can be very detrimental to the organization and to the atmosphere. And then maybe even the first attribute that I should have started off with is really seeing the other people in your group. I think it's absolutely critical for a leader to be watching the people around her or him to understand what their talents are, how they can be utilized, and also to listen to their thoughts. I have found that the best group that I can put together is one where I'm always asking for their feedback and their input, and that's because I really like those people and I really care, so it's sincere. But B, when you get people engaged in a project and you're really listening to them, they become invested in the project and they give you even more in terms of productivity and creativity and everything you want for whatever project it is you're managing because they're invested. So those are the attributes that I think are really important for a leader. And then the other, I guess what I wish I had known, or that I didn't know back in the day, was really to trust my instincts. The times that I've gotten into trouble in my career, and I have gotten into trouble a couple of times in my career, is where I decided not to speak up, and I really should have made my voice heard. I saw a situation unfolding and not unfolding in a way that was positive, but I didn't know that for sure. That was just my hunch. And I didn't stand up and say, hey, listen, what about this argument? This has to be said. We may not win if somebody doesn't make this argument. And because I was a little bit, I was lower down on the totem pole, I didn't speak up. And so I think it's really important that within your organization that you always speak up and bring the points to bear that can make for a stronger outcome at the end of the day, even if that's a little bit risky for you. I think that's an important thing to do.
Yeah, I think nobody that I've ever talked to anyway, or any book I've ever read, said I got to this level of success I have because I knew when to keep my mouth shut. It's important to know when to keep your mouth shut, but it's generally not when you think it is.
No.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
You probably can't share the details of that story you just related, can you?
No. I mean, that's my problem a little bit today, is my stories can't be very specific, can they?
We appreciate it. Those of us on the client side appreciate that. Thank you.
Because I do have a lot of stories. But
Is there anything that you wanted to tell me, but I didn't ask the right question?
There's one other thing that I think is important in terms of really looking at, because you had talked about or asked me also about your successes and how do you really achieve success, and this would be separate and apart from being a leader. And I think in my job, when I have an intellectual property and really just a way of finding the path for intellectual property protection, is you just have to stare and think and consider the problem long enough until you find an answer. And what I've found generally is if you're patient and you contemplate whatever's in front of you long enough, you can find your path forward. It's sort of like finding the window in the burning building, right? The window's there somewhere. You just have to find it. Yeah. And so I would say that's one way that I've had the greatest success, is really to take a look at whatever problem I'm looking at, which is usually the dilemma of the client somewhere along the way, until I find exactly the path that's going to serve the client's interests.
Yeah. Boy, I've had days like that where I felt like it was a burning building. I couldn't find the window. Now, I love that, actually, because it speaks to persistence and confidence and analytical. Just, sometimes I think that people imagine that there are people who just get it and they just know the answers to all the problems. And what I think that some people don't realize is that person didn't know at the beginning what the heck they were going to do, right? But they knew if they thought about it and contemplated long enough, they would come up with something.
Right.
They would find a way. And it does, listeners don't know this, but we just finished a life science lunch panel, and I was telling you before we started recording, I had sort of an emotional journey because it was talking about the General Data Protection Regulation. Did I get that right?
I think you did.
That the European Union is passing, and the gentleman sitting next to me, one of my colleagues at BPM, we had this little quiet conversation, and I went from, oh my God, how is this going to work? It's just, this is the, forgive me, this is the European Lawyer Full Employment Act. He knows me, and he knows I was joking, by the way. So no offense intended.
Oh, don't worry. The American lawyers are much worse.
Oh, yeah. That's funny. But it's taking a look at, so the GDPR is just an example of something that you could be initially shocked by, and how is this going to work, and this is just going to be terrible, and then ask questions, listen, and you will get that insight at some point. For me, it was when he said, or when actually Kristen Eilenberg says, well, it's like you have to comply with FDA regulations,
right?
So this is another regulation you have to comply with. We know how to do this.
Right. Go learn it.
Go learn it. And once you learn it and you implement it, now you have another, this sounds cynical, but it's not really, but you've created another barrier to entry for competition, really.
Right.
If I understand how to do this and I have a company that is in compliance, now there's another hurdle competitors would have to overcome. So it's a mindset at that point. So I really appreciate that.
Tenacity.
That insight.
It's tenacity.
Tenacity, yeah.
Yeah, it
Never
really
give
is.
up, right?
Nope.
Sounds like a good note to take a break on.
Sure.
And then when we come back, we will do the rapid fire round, if you're ready.
I'll try.
There is no try. There's only do.
There's
or
only
not do.
Yeah, I will just do it.
Yoda. A very special thanks to our first sponsor this week. It's the Indiana Health Industry Forum. IHIF is a statewide trade association representing Indiana's health science business community. The diverse members of the Indiana Health Industry Forum generate the collective voice of the state's health and life science industry. Their mission is to connect key stakeholders to enhance business networks, advocate for member interests, develop workforce skills, and provide strategic vision in the interest of growing the state's health industry, economy, and reputation. Please take a look at their site for more information. It's ihif.org, and you can learn about how they serve members across Indiana. Their leadership members include companies like Lilly, Cook, IU Health, and some other sponsors of theirs are Roche and Fort Wayne Metals. So please check out ihif.org and check out their sponsors. And thank you so much to Kristen Jones, their fabulous CEO and president. And also thanks to IHIF. Now back to the show. Welcome back. We're here with Deborah Pollack-Milgate. By the way, interesting fact. This is about my 11th interview, I think. Second one where the person I'm speaking with speaks fluent German.
The first one was German, right?
The first one was actually German, from Germany, Rainer Fischer. So when you meet him, the two of you should auf Deutsch reden.
Yeah, machen wir.
So I know enough German to be dangerous. I'll tell you the story, and then my editor can decide whether to leave it in.
Okay.
You probably will knowing him. So I went to Klaus's, the butcher, the German butcher with the sausages.
Yes.
I'm sure you've been there. And I was trying to tell him I wanted 10 of these sausages, right? And I kept saying 10. He keeps going, 2? No, 10. It's like, 9? No, 10. And he's like, sprechen Sie Deutsch? And I took German in high school, college. I went to Germany just for a few months. So I was fluent back then, but now I'm not. But he wanted to speak in German, so the rest of our transaction was in German. And I barely got by, but I got by. So that was,
excellent.
It was fun. I didn't tell this story to Rainer because I was afraid he would want to speak.
That he would launch into German.
Yeah,
you aren't scared of me.
Well, you're not, German not being your first language.
Okay, I won't.
I know you're fluent, but I would probably. I wasn't afraid you would jump into it because I probably, with your accent, I'm sure your accent is perfect, but for some reason when it's
not perfect.
It's easier to understand, I'm sure, than a native speaker. Anyway, Deborah.
Yes,
I'm ready. Are you ready?
Yes,
for the
ready.
rapid fire round? Let's go.
Yes, okay.
Finish the following sentence. One principle I will never compromise is...
It's basic. It's integrity.
Good one. Every One thing every aspiring leader should stop doing today.
Stop talking. Leaders talk way too much.
What's one thing every leader should start doing today?
You know what I'm going to say, right? Start listening.
I was hoping you would say that.
And start looking, right? Start seeing the people around you.
Fantastic. And don't just see them, see them.
See them. Really see them. See what they can bring to the table, because you're missing out. We are not using all the talents of the people around us, and they have many.
Yes, love it. And what are you reading these days? You have an inspirational book?
So I do have an answer to this one.
Oh, thank goodness.
And I have a few things I read, and I find that I have to really vary what I read. So I like to read because sometimes politics and world events can be pretty heavy. I actually enjoy children's literature a lot. So I read that. I read with my son. We just finished the book, which is the Trials of Morgan Crow. And we're working on, or I'm reading on my own, I'm reading the latest book. I think it's the latest book by Trenton Stewart. He did the series on the Benedict Society. And I just find children's literature, it has all of the insight of adult literature without all of the drama thrown in. So I enjoy that a lot. I obviously read a lot about what's happening in the IP world. That's always changing, so I keep up with that as well. And I feel like I'm also really obligated to read, and this is completely off topic, but to read what women are writing and what minorities are writing about gender bias, implicit bias, and really trying to pay attention in sort of in this Me Too world of what women are saying, what others are saying, and how we can be more accommodating and inclusive in a real way. So I read a lot about, I really read everything I can get my hands on that women and others are writing on those topics. And then you have to laugh. So then I read The Onion. And I cannot repeat anything that any of the Onion's headlines,
right,
because none of them are appropriate. But I highly recommend it because because things are also so heavy these days, you have to laugh, right?
I completely agree.
So The Onion.
I love all of those. Well, laugh at me for a second because you mentioned women and minorities and gender bias and implicit bias, etc. It's one of the things I'm trying to learn a lot about as a tall white man.
Right.
It's important for me to understand the advantages I have and use them for good. Right.
Right.
Not try to get rid of them, but use them for good and to lift others up if it needs to happen. But the way we laugh at me is the fact that I kept mispronouncing your name in the beginning, and normally I ask people to tell me about their personal life, and I completely missed that part. So you have a son. How old is your son?
I do. I have two sons.
Okay.
I have a 9-year-old and a 13-year-old, and I have a daughter who is 17.
Oh, great.
So I have 3 of them.
Wow. I love talking to parents of daughters, especially. I have 2 daughters, and it's a ride, isn't it?
It is.
It's a fun ride.
It's a ride.
Yeah.
Yes.
And speaking of daughters, this is probably more appropriate for my other fun podcast, but my 13-year-old daughter came to us the other day and said, "Did you realize that the leader of North Korea was sent to a concentration camp for crossing the border into South Korea?" We're like, "What are you talking about?" And that didn't happen. She's like, "What is that, fake news?" Where did you see this? She has an Instagram account, and she's like, "It's this news site called The Onion." And we lost it because we lived in Chicago for a while before the internet days, and you pick The Onion up at any bar or restaurant or whatever.
Right.
We've loved it for decades. It was one of those moments. Do you have a specific, thanks for the 2 book recommendations.
Sure.
When it comes to IP and keeping current with that, do you have a specific resource that people could use to keep current?
Well, there are a couple of good IP blogs out there. There's one called Patently O by Dennis Crouch. It's very, very, and as the name suggests, it's very patent heavy, but it will keep you up to date on the latest and greatest.
How would I spell that?
Patently,
L-Y.
just like it sounds, LYO, and with an O on the end. Okay. There's also a site called IP Watchdog, and there's some good. They have some good content as well. Those are really the two sources that come to mind at the moment. Some of us in this field, we get an IP 360 alert, which gives us a good blurb and gives us a good overview of all of the latest and greatest IP trends.
So BT Law would be a good resource too, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, yes.
Excellent.
And I do draft something too quarterly. I do an IP newsletter, but it's in German, so. I'm sorry about that.
I have a certificate in German translation, so maybe I can translate it.
You can. And actually, these days, Google Translate is
That's true.
Catching up. So
it's about as good as anything, isn't it?
Yes.
Well, Deborah, thank you so much. This has been one of the most informative and inspiring episodes that I've had, and I sure appreciate you taking the time to do it.
Well, I really don't believe that, but you are absolutely welcome.
I did say one of the.
There you go.
As I sit here right now.
You're inspired.
I'm inspired.
Excellent.
That's right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You have just experienced the Life Science Effect. If you liked it, be sure and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. And more importantly, tell your colleagues, your boss, your friends. It'll make you look smart. Maybe it'll even get you a raise. Thanks again to our presenting sponsor, BPM Associates. Set your medical innovations in motion. BPM helps life sciences companies design, manage, and execute their most complex projects. What effect will you cause? And thanks to today's guest. Let us know who else I should be talking to. Send me an email at steven.vinson@bpm-associates.com. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. Now go make something wonderful happen.